My name is Elizabeth Ansert, and this lecture is going to be focusing on how to write a research question, and I'm going to explain my process that I've developed since I started working on research projects. I'm also going to briefly talk about how you turn your research question into a hypothesis and an actual research objective. If I can get my slide to turn. When we first start wanting to get into research, a lot of us ask, where do I even begin? I started off much like my nephew in the picture, and he's trying to learn how to make corn pudding for our Thanksgiving dinner back in Kentucky. So he has all the ingredients in his bowl. He's dressed in his super cute little ladybug apron, and he's trying his best to mix all those ingredients. However, it can be really overwhelming, and he almost gave up at one point because the ingredients weren't mixing together the way he wanted. And a lot of us can go through this process and have these kinds of reactions when we first start research, because it can be very frustrating when we're starting out. Thankfully, research is mostly about our interests and our passions. And if we find a particular area of pediatric medicine or surgery that we love, then that'll inevitably lead to our own questions and curiosities. So our foundation and our starting point in any research is our interests, curiosities, and our passions. One thing we have to be willing to do, though, is to just dive right in. We can read and ask and observe all of these questions and have all of these ideas, but it's an entirely different world when we start getting into conducting research and actually practicing our skills. A lot of us find this out when we actually get into the OR for the first time, either as fourth-year students on our rotations or as first-year residents, and we see these really good attendings performing these procedures, and they look so simple. But we don't realize how much skill is actually needed for these procedures, and to actually perform them is actually a very difficult task. It's kind of the same with research, and a lot is learned by doing the research ourselves. So don't be afraid to put your ideas out there and give it your all and just dive right in. Finding an interest or a research topic is different for every person. Personally, I tend to generate most of my ideas from a culmination of different resources. However, this doesn't mean that there's only one way to come up with a good research topic. Most of us are often used to the method of developing ideas by reading something that's new to us. This could be from a journal article or from a list of readings that I've used to study boards or something along those lines. And I'll usually sit there and I'll read it and I'll try and absorb the material. And then I wonder if it would be different if they used X, Y, and Z, or how the outcomes would be different if this happened. And so usually I'm not the first person to have this thought. So I usually turn to a primary literature search to kind of develop my idea a little bit further. This can be through PubMed, Google Scholar, or other research resources that you have available to answer your question. This can also help to redefine your question and see what related research is out there. If you still don't find the answer to your question, bringing up the idea to someone that you know or somebody that has a good idea of this topic is usually my next step. This can be in my day-to-day process of generally talking to attendings or colleagues, or even reaching out to somebody that published a research article that I read and just developing ideas through them. Another way that I've done it before is through conferences. I've attended some sessions that they'll showcase debates in thought processes, techniques, or controversies within the literature. And these are usually super interesting sessions to go to. And the great thing about these controversies in the literature is this usually gives some background for both aspects of the controversy, as well as it provides a good ground for future literature research ideas. So one of the easiest ways to do this, like I said, is to go through by an example. So I have an example of hammer toes throughout the entire lecture. So that way it kind of gives us an idea and we can work through this process together. So hammer toe fixation has two schools of thought. Some physicians believe that IM fixation is the best method, while others believe that K-wire fixation gives superior advantages. If a new researcher were to have a well-developed study comparing the two forms of fixation, it would greatly add to our body of literature that exists within the field. So if this were an idea a researcher wanted to pursue, it's important to have the most up-to-date information in order to develop a good research question, and subsequently a good research design. For me, this again is when I turn to my search engines or to a colleague. And again, this can include Google Scholar, PubMed, MESH, and national associations like ACVAS or APNA or something like that. We're going to go through more in-depth literature reviews at a different part of the series, but a thorough literature review is the important step when we're developing our research question. So just while I'm glazing over it, because it's going to be a portion in the next series, I just want to make sure that that's understood. But we need to know what information in the literature is out there, how other researchers have designed their ideas to study this topic, and what information is still missing, and or what the authors felt like information needed to be questioned or buffed up on. Once I have this information, I'm ready to develop a good research question. So a good research question is a clear, concise, complex, and arguable question that has to do with my particular interest. Often the best research question is something that we are genuinely curious about and interested in, because after all, reading all of that material and going through all of that process of our preliminary literature research is going to be very tedious and very hard to get through if it's not something that you are genuinely interested in. There are 2 criteria models that we can use to help develop a good research question. The first is called the FINER model. Often the criteria areas can overlap, but the checklist helps to make sure that we're getting the most out of our question. So first, the question we need to assess is it feasible? We should be able to have a reasonable number of subjects, have good techniques that can be followed by others, be affordable, and have a reasonable timeline for us to reach our goals. Our aims also have to be measurable outcomes, and we have to stay within the research team's set skills. So for example, if you want to research supramalleolar osteotomies or femur osteotomies, that's a little bit out of our scope in some areas. So that wouldn't exactly be within our skill set. So a research question also needs to be interesting. We need to answer the question, and it should be intriguing to other researchers, our peers, and other members of the scientific community. Your scientific question should also be novel, and usually the question has to confirm, expand on, or refute previous literature findings. And it has to be able to improve the methodological flaws of previous studies. And like all good research, the question should of course be ethical. This is determined by an internal review board, which we will again review at a later date. However, we must think about the outcomes of the patient after the research is done. For example, should the patient be able to continue the research if it's helping them after the study? And finally, the question needs to be relevant to scientific knowledge. This can be research generating new knowledge and the potential of future research. And does it provide an adequate answer to our specific question? The second criteria is a Peacock criteria. To me, this looks more like the methodological aspect of research, but it still needs to be addressed, and it brings up very important points when we're developing our methodology and our general research idea. With some of these areas missing and we can't develop a good methodological aspect of our research, then it's not a very good research question. So first, the groups, what groups are in our population of interest? So what's your patient's age, what's their gender, what's their race, past medical history, pathologies, etc. What are all of these things that we're trying to consider in our question? What's the intervention that we're doing? What are we looking at in our experimental group? And what are we planning to do for these patients? Or what are we planning to try and not do for our experimental group versus our control group? Is your new idea going to help those people that are in your population? Is there going to be a comparison? So is there a control group for the research project? And it can be an alternative to the treatment that you're trying, or there can actually be no treatment as well, or even just a standard of care, depending on what the literature supports. Next, you're going to look at your outcome and what you're trying to achieve. You'll need measurable variables that are going to look at and determine the difference between the intervention and the control group. You want to try and stick to outcome measurements that are familiar to the researchers and the readers. It's often helpful to use validated data collection tools, such as a questionnaire or something that's sensitive, specific, and highly reliable. So that way it can be related to and used throughout your research. And finally, what's your project's timeline? What's the duration that you're going to be collecting this data? And it must be reasonable for both the researchers and for the participants. All right. So we need to know what specific question and that does not have a definitive answer in previous literature. Often there's a disagreement on the answer among expert physicians. And we want to know if we can point to a book and say, is this a final answer because X, Y, and Z? Can you point to several books or several sources and say, these are major resources in the field and they all say that this is the correct answer? If that's the case, then maybe our question isn't that novel. If the answer to that is, no, I can't find a definitive answer, then we've met the FINER and Peacock criteria, and then we can actually start developing our research question. Our example in this case is, does the PI-PJ fusion occur more consistently with an IM fixation versus a K-wire fixation? So that's going to be our example that we're working through in our process. We want to look at our study and we want to add up our body of literature and see what we can come up with. We think back to the limitations that we've already found in our previous literature, such as large sample size, generalizability, longer follow-ups, examinational costs, et cetera, et cetera. So now we're going to apply that to the final criteria. So is this feasible? So yes, hammer toe fixation can be done and has been done for many years, and it's a very common problem. Usually the surgery is covered by insurances, so you can also assess the results in many different ways, such as x-rays, patient satisfaction, physical exam, et cetera. So is this interesting? For me, I find it very interesting, especially because it's a very common problem in podiatry and in surgery. So it's often regarded as one of the bread and butter surgeries of our field. So it's interesting because it is extremely relevant to our field. In this example, we're going to say that this is a novel study because we're seeking to confirm fixation techniques that have a better fusion rate based on the fixation that we use. Is it ethical? Yes, the results are reliable and both are accepted methods of fixation for a hammer toe. And finally, is this question relevant? Again, yes, it's relevant because the question we're generating, we're looking for a standard of fixation to add to the literature because there is a controversy. And because this is, again, a common surgery, it can affect how many physicians practice across the country. So then if we look at our Peacock criteria, I look at my population. And so for this study, we're going to say the patients just are going to be required to have a hammer toe deformity. There's a lot that goes into that. And, you can kind of tweak that to your specific criteria, your specific research question. But for our example, we're just going to say that they need to have a hammer toe. My intervention is going to be, or my intervention that I'm measuring is the rate of fusion between the two types of fixation. And the comparison groups are the IM implant or the K-wire fixation. And my interested outcome is the PIPJ fusion for both of these techniques. And finally, I want to have adequate length of follow-up to assess the results, but it's not unnecessarily long. So we know that, for example, bone healing usually takes 6 to 8 weeks. And often literature will follow up these patients for about a year as well. Some do 6 months, but that depends, again, on the literature. So now my question satisfies all of the criteria for a good research question, and I can develop my hypothesis. So first I start with a null hypothesis. That's kind of our stake and something that we can really hold on to. And our null hypothesis states that there's going to be no difference between these two K-wire fixations. And any of the observed differences are due to sampling or experimental error. And so from there, I want to develop either my one or two-sided hypothesis. A one-sided hypothesis is specific to one outcome and excludes all other possibilities. A two-sided outcome will find differences between the two groups. So in our example, a two-sided hypothesis would say that one of the forms of fixation is superior to the other, but it does not specify which. The two-sided hypothesis is used often in literature because it allows for a wider range of the possibilities. And then to further this point, if the hypothesis is not supported by the results, then the null hypothesis is assumed to be true. Because we don't want to exclude any significant differences found, a two-sided hypothesis generally avoids the type 2 errors in rejecting a false null. So this hypothesis is then turned into a research objective. The objective keeps the focus in the study and is one of the cornerstones in guiding the research. It's so easy to get turned around and go through in several different directions based on what you find and how your research process is going. So to have a clear research objective, this keeps us in line and keeps us from half of us wanting to go one direction and then the other half of us wanting to go the other direction. So for our example, our objective is that this study will compare the fusion rates between IM and K-wire fixation at the IP joint of the toe. This is developed as a two-sided hypothesis so that we can see if there's any significant difference that allows for a more comprehensive study to include all of the possible outcomes. So now it's time for a quick celebration. We can put our party hats on and get really excited because we've made a lot of progress. We've done our preliminary research and our literature search. We've developed a good research question, and we've developed our hypothesis and our research objective. So from here, we can continue to investigate our previous literature, add IRBs, develop our research method, build our relevance, and develop a solid protocol with clear and concise focus.